The Book of Kha. 1. Boy. My whole existence was the desert, the sand, the wind, the scrub, and the unrelenting, pulsing yellow sun were my whole reality. And I knew of no other world, no other existence. Only two things were real to me in the desert: the constant, pulsating sun and the ever-present pool. I walked, pulled by something stronger than my own human heart, something outside myself, yet internal as well. It needed me and I needed it. If I could have formed thoughts, lucid moments of understanding, of the memories burned away by that orb in the sky that erratically pulsed bright to dim and back over and over, perhaps I could have named it. On I walked toward that pool, day and night, the beating of the sun during the day and the glowing swirls of color, greens, blues, and purples in the night. If I remembered what hate was, I would have hated that damnable sun and the coarse, abrasive nature of the sand. It was everywhere, rubbing my skin raw in places I could never have known existed, without that unique, abrasive annoyance and pain. I didn't know when I saw the mountains, peaks topped with white, water, shelter, and something pulling me that were near those peaks or in them. I walked on. If my body failed and I slept, I knew it not. If I found moisture or shade, I remember it only as a dream that never satisfied any of my needs. I was clothed in tan burlap, worn, torn, and soiled. As shoes, I had nothing more than thin blocks of wood strapped to my feet with thin leather thongs. There is no understanding in my memories that could tell me how long I walked. It could have been a few days or a few years, and I knew nothing of what came before. From one moment to the next, however, I found myself walking toward a group of small, low huts in the hills just before the mountains. They were yurts. My mind had come up with the word for those structures. That is not the desert, I found myself whispering, in a voice that cracked and scratched from both its lack of moisture and lack of use. Words. I had words, but I couldn't remember where the words came from or why I knew them. I just did. I came back to myself, and I was inside one of the structures, sitting at a low table across from a gray-robed old man. "What is your name, child?" his smooth accent asked. "Boy," I replied automatically without any thought. "And who are your parents, boy?" the older man asked, his eyes narrowed. I could not answer. I did not know of anyone else that existed but this old man and myself. I just looked at the gruff, bearded man and his seemingly young blue eyes, surrounded by ancient worry lines and crow's feet that seemed carved into his face like the canyons upon the scarred earth in the desert. "How long were you out there?" he asked, waving at the air, his voice low and resigned. I just shook my head. The old man waited a long time before speaking again. "I am called Usher," he told me. "Usher." I tried the word and nodded. "Guide." He leaned back. "That's what the word usher means, but where are you from, child?" he asked again. "The waste." It was my turn to gesture at the world outside the leather-clad hut. "You should not have been able to survive out there in the flaring sun," the old man growled at me, yet seemingly to himself. "Why did you say waste and not desert?" I just waited. The answer to his question was unknown to me. It was the word that came to my brain. Do you know where you were going? He asked me as if he had expected another non-response. Instead, I involuntarily looked in the direction of that pool. It was strong now, almost strong enough for me to ignore this old man and get up and go. His eyes seemed to show some sort of recognition at my glance. The temple, he spoke with conviction. Wash him, he said to someone I could not see. Get him some suitable clothing. Aye, sir. The woman's voice responded from behind me. I must be taking him with me tonight, the old man decided. Boy, he then spoke to me directly. I will take you to the temple. Again, his voice was resigned as if he had no choice. I just turned and looked at the direction the pool wanted me to go. That was all to me now. The pool. Once washed, clothed, and fed, I followed the old man as the sun set behind the mountains up a narrow and seemingly little-used path out of the little village. It took 2 nights, trudging up steep hills and ravines to make our way to the old man's destination. He seemed afraid of that pulsing sun, so he insisted we rest under cover during daylight hours. If the pool were in a different direction than the old man was taking me, I'm sure I would have ditched him and followed that instead of him. Are you hurt? I found myself asking sometime during the trek. No, he seemed surprised that I asked. And I suppose that I was just as surprised. Why? He asked, stopping and turning toward me. You walk as if it pains you, I said with concern. For a child who appears to be no more than 10 years old, and one who doesn't speak very often, I'd say you were well educated. No, child, he sighed then. I am just old. He paused, turning back toward the steep and rocky incline where we were climbing, and finished to himself in a low voice I could barely hear. Just so very, very old. On the last time that we stopped, Usher began trying to pull memories from me. Memories I unfortunately did not have. What do you remember, boy? He began. The desert, I told him. The desert and I hesitated. The pool. Describe this pool, he wished to know. I was confused. Something, I touched my chest, has me here and pulls me to some place I know not. I glanced up toward the peak. You know not. You don't speak right. I do know one thing, though, the old man commented. I just waited, uncaring. You are from old America, around the Texas region, I suppose. Oklahoma, Arkansas, something like that. I don't know, I tried. I don't know those names or places. I glanced back up toward where the pool was coming from. In the old world, I was a scholar, a linguist, an archaeologist, among many other things. I had degrees from this institution and that. Not that any of that matters anymore. He told me as he prepared a meal of dried meat and stale flat bread he'd taken from the village. Old world? I asked, trying to express to the old man that I did not care what he was talking about with my tone. I did not understand why he was afraid of the sun. Before the sun killed the modern age, he recalled it like it was a memory of heaven. I said nothing, just searched the slopes for a way up and toward my destination, though I couldn't see much from the outcropping we sheltered beneath. Before the solar flares, his tone becoming even more incredulous. I do not understand, it's just the sun, I told him without looking at him. when the world was on the verge of either evolving itself or subjugating itself to the rise of artificial intelligence, he began. The sun started having a fit, you might say. Solar flares, some large, some small, but too many to track, even if we could have done so by the time the second big one erupted. I sat and listened as my eyes continued their futile search for a new path. It killed every electronic system on the land, in the sea, in the air, and in space itself. He paused for a moment, recalling his past. Oh, governments had hardened equipment and some sheltered beneath the ground, but the flares never stopped. So technology and information to recreate is gone. Every time that monster up there pulses with another flare, it sends an electromagnetic pulse out. Our technology couldn't resist that, and the old technology was impossible to remanufacture. Everyone had forgotten, you see. We couldn't even communicate on a scale we hadn't seen since the Middle Ages. Now, we had lost the knowledge to recreate it, even if we could. What happened? I asked, starting to let myself become distracted to the story. War, famine, plague, death. He grunted out each one as if listing a recipe. All four of the damned horsemen. I sat confused. How old are you? He waited and looked at me. I don't know. There's not really a way to track time in the temple. But I'd be willing to suspect it's been over 100 years. Don't ask me why I'm still alive, I know not. A world population of 12 billion, halved in one decade and halved again in another. Who really knows the actual count now? I doubt anyone has bothered taking a census. Our society was sent back to an age where the best efforts to reclaim what we'd lost is steam power, and very few even have that. Or so I'm told. Why is it that you hide from the sun? I asked finally, bringing my eyes over to him. The flares? Yes, child, he responded. The EMPs are not good for flesh and bone human beings. I suspect no more than it is for our old technology. He sighed. That is why I suspect you can't even remember who you are, where you're from, who your parents were, or even your own name. They will stop, you know, I said, moving my head back around to search the past and check the path and check the time by the light beyond the outcropping. What will? He asked. The flares. Someday they will stop. Someday soon. I told him, though I didn't know how I knew it, but I knew it to be true. You think so, do you? His voice was amused. Yes, was all I said. Once darkness shrouded us once again, the only light, that aurora borealis illuminating our way, we continued up into the mountains. My mind wandered. What Usher told me as we went, and before I could let the pool bring me back to reality, we stood before the mouth of a great cave, one that appeared to be not much more than a crack in the side of a sheer cliff face. It was only wide enough for one person to walk, yet tall enough for a giant. I and my team found this ancient structure about 20 years before the flares. That was 2044. And I was here the day everything died. He told me as we made our way through the dark cave, lit only by glowing moss on the walls and ceiling. What is it? The pool was becoming something else now, and I spoke to ignore the fear of what that brought me. A temple. He stopped and turned his gray robes enveloping from under his hood. A temple built before Noah saw his flood. But I believe not long before that. In the days of what, the Nephilim? I said, the word popping into my head. The thought came from outside myself, both my own thought and that of something or someone else. Yes, he nodded, surprised that I knew. This structure calls itself the first temple of the Kha, or rather, it is of, I believe it more. He paused, looking for the right word. Time capsule. He turned and began walking as I followed into an open chamber in the cave, one large enough to fit a little village we'd just left. One large enough for us to fit the little village we had just left. On the opposite side of us stood glowing torches outlining a tall, wide doorway made from a rock of the mountain itself, as if melted and molded. We entered the first chamber that looked as if the old man had been living in for years. Every surface, walls, floors, and ceilings were covered with markings and drawings, paneled out in order. An ancient language I could almost recognize, that seemed familiar to me, as if it were a memory of an old dream. The language of the ancients, he said, noting my direction of thought. I call it Babel, the old man told me, a smirk showing amidst his crazy white beard. Sit, he pointed at the table and some chairs set in the center of a large chamber. I followed him over to the table and sat down in a chair opposite him. It was covered with journals and pages of paper, written hastily. We studied this language for years, he began. We used every technological advantage we could find and could not quite crack the key to unlock and translate the text. I listened, though overwhelmed by the pull that had become like a blanket wrapped around me. It was some time after the flares that I found it, a mathematical equation etched upon a tile in the very center of. He paused. What I have began to call the meditation room. It was the key to translating the text. And I've spent almost every hour of every day in the years since translating and writing the information in English. He stopped and looked at me pointedly. Do you read, boy? I shrugged. One moment. He stood and went off to the side and dug through several old and dusty boxes, searching. He sighed with satisfaction. Here it is. He returned and set a large leather-bound tome on the table before me. I was lucky enough to bring a number of books with me, a library of the great philosophers and thinkers from my past. The old man called Usher, opened it, and turned a few pages. Can you read that first part there, boy? He touched the page full of tiny script. In the beginning, I began to read. God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. I read. It was automatic, something I didn't even have to think about. It was just there. Genesis 1:1, he noted, sounding satisfied. Well, that should make things easier, no matter what we end up with here. In you, boy. I don't understand, I told him. He nodded. And you won't until tomorrow. Let's eat first, he said, and began moving around them, building a fire from a small stack of scrub wood and branches he'd set to the far wall of the hall. With a hanging pot he'd made of some sort of porridge. It tasted to be from sheep's milk and grain flour. It was good and warm, and I found it very welcome. You will be able to read the entire history and all the stories I've translated soon. But I will give you the overview. He paused, looking up from his own bowl. Stop me anytime you wish to ask questions. If you feel the need, I was once a professor, after all, a teacher, if you might say. I just nodded, scraping the last of my meal out of the wooden bowl. From the time of Adam and Eve until the cataclysm that caused the great flood, we know from Noah's history, there was an advanced civilization that lived and dwelt upon the world. Usher began. I nodded, setting my bowl aside. That advanced ancient civilization was one of wonder, light, and great darkness. It was a time of all myths and legends from which they evolved. Myths? I asked. The Roman myths, the Nordic myths, the Indian myths, almost every myth from every ancient culture. They were different. Well, they were both different and the same. Some being retellings of the same figures of a historical nature. Whoever Hercules was, for example, he lived then. Just like Beowulf lived during those thousands of years at some point. Even the so-called gods in most pantheons were of those years, that age of humankind before the flood. I listened, and my fascination grew. As I understand it, that civilization was based not on the technology like what I was used to and ours evolved into, but of two things we likely could not comprehend. An earth that provided, he grunted before continuing. For example, they did not need matches or lighters or even flint and steel. But there was a lizard that crawled and was found all across the world, that when squeezed, it spat a flaming acid that could start fires. I suspect that's where our legends of dragons come from, after all. I waited as the old man gathered his thoughts. The other thing was an energy that the humans could harness through their subconscious. They called this energy the Kha. That word rang in my head like the whole mountain had been struck, like an anvil. Everyone could access the Kha, or touch it. However, only a few could use it to its full potential. These men and women were the heroes and godlings of those myths and legends of that age. Godlings? I asked. Those who thought of themselves as powerful as gods. Little g. They were indeed powerful, but the text says they were arrogant and corrupt. After all, those with power eventually succumb to its natural conclusion, the subjugation of others. There are two sides. The thoughts came to me from outside, but I knew them to be true. I said. And I said it is almost as if I were remembering something. The Kha and the Ra. Yes, the old man said, setting his bowl aside. Looking at me, his eyes narrowed. How do you know these things, yet do not know your own name? It is frustrating. The Nephilim could use this power as well, the Ra. And they were the balance. As mankind used the Kha to advance itself, the Nephilim and their descendants used the Ra to make war, destroy, and manipulate. What happened? I asked. It was me this time, not some influence from outside. Well, they were punished, or it was a coincidence, though I'm no longer sure that coincidence even existed in the first place. He chuckled. Punished? I asked. He nodded. A comet. Shook his head. The text describes it as a world killer. It would have reduced the Earth to rubble if collided. There would be no Earth in the universe, no human beings left, not even anything to remember us. We are here, I noted. Indeed, he nodded. They built this temple and others because they knew it would survive. Why? I asked shrewdly. Why what? He smiled. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. Because of what you probably are. But I have to finish the story to answer your next question, you know. And my next question was, why was I there? What was I to this ancient underground temple? Why bring me to it? In a moment of some uncommon unity the human race has never seen since, they touched the Kha and used it to destroy or deflect the comet. So we are here, I noted again. And they aren't, though. The comet was deflected, and two things happened. I know. Fragments from that great comet hit the Earth anyway, over the course of a few hundred years, and it killed almost the entire population, with floods and volcanoes and earthquakes. He paused, thinking. It must have been a cataclysm on a scale that our minds could not comprehend. He stopped and waited for me to ask questions. So I waited, and I had none. The text states that those who called themselves gods, who were like unto tyrants, were punished for their arrogance by the Creator himself. What that Bible there calls God, and those that worship them also. Figures like Zeus, Odin, Vishnu, and many others. Names even that we have no myths for, because they were long forgotten. All of them were named here in this temple, the text written upon each of these tiles. It says they were responsible for the flood. They wrote all that here in this temple, I asked. Usher nodded. Oh yes, that and much, much more. More? A prophecy. But that will have to wait. He nodded toward the two mats we made up while we were waiting on the porridge to cook. You need to get some sleep, and then, when we wake, we will go to the meditation room. Why? I asked, knowing that he was right. I needed to go there. To test you, he said, climbing into his own pallet. Sleep, boy. Tomorrow, you will get your name, if I am correct. I laid down myself, but couldn't help but feel that Usher was almost afraid of that he was terrified even that he was indeed right. What was the second thing? I asked. Humanity lost its ability to touch the Kha, or the Ra for that matter, he replied. I lay there until I heard the old man begin to snore, and then drifted off into a troubled sleep.